This audio is taken from an actual consultation with an elite admissions coach. Listen carefully as he discusses how he helps students get into the most competitive universities in the world and what he learned from sitting in on final admissions decisions at these schools. For part two, go to hippocamposacademy.us.
I was working with students more and more one-on-one, a lot of international students. I got into this niche teaching AP classes in psychology and the English to students if their school didn't have the classes. And a few of those parents started asking me if I'd help further on the college applications. And I had no idea. Your mom can probably tell you 20 years ago, we were like writing out applications by hand, and that's self-selecting in itself because you're like, I'm only going to write all my information so many times that I'm just not applying to any more schools. But Common App came out like teenish. So it was all around that same time. And I realized as I dug deeper and deeper into it, what these students were missing and what nobody was teaching them was the importance of telling a good story because otherwise it all looks the same. And that is what's different about the essays. You know, you've got your transcripts and your numbers and your test scores, and those are what they are for the most part. At this point, you're not going to go back and retake classes or anything like that. You're a good student. It tells schools just practically speaking, can you succeed in our classes? Got your honors and activities list, which is always a lot smaller than students want it to be. A lot of space in there. And so that tells a little bit more about you, how you've been spending your time. And then we had these essays, right? And the thing with the essays, I realized quickly was that they couldn't be just let's long form write out our activities and honors list. So this is all stuff that we all know now, obviously, but it was kind of a whole brave new world back then. And my students were really successful right off the bat. And I think because a lot of people will come into this after they've been in administration. And I came into it just off the bat with storytelling that did really set my students apart really well in the beginning. And it really shaped the way that I go about things. Every year I'd go back over my notes and look at how everybody's done and see how I can kind of tweak the process for the next year, you know, because it's always changing. What schools are looking for is always changing, what they're needing in students, what people who are going to be hiring you might be looking for. Because of the research I've been doing at some of these elite schools, I've had the chance to sit in on decisions meetings, and those are really interesting before I went on what made sense to me, you know, like this just makes sense. This is a psychological principle. This is how people respond to things. So we're going to try that. You know, like marketing, advertising, all of that psychology based, right? And you are marketing yourself. It'll be good practice for you. But the biggest recent thing I've realized has been noticing. So whenever I tell students something like, we want to make sure your admissions officer is compelled by your story, that they're liking you. It's a lot harder to reject someone if you like them a little bit most of the time. So, sitting in on these meetings lately, what I've been watching for is whenever an admissions officer will stand up. Okay, so how these look, you send in your applications, and it goes to your regional admissions officer. And they have what I call the no and maybe pile. So they are looking for that. Can they handle it here, even just academically or what? And the students who go on to what I call the maybe pile, those are all students with your good grades and good extracurriculars. But then you get to that issue that everyone knows is the issue. Because at that point, now all my grades look like everybody else's, right? Now, even all my activities look a lot. There are only so many experiences a 17-year-old has had time to have. So I always tell students that part of what we're doing is finding these parts of your story that are going to show them like you and they're interested in you. They know you've had all the same experiences as everyone else. They know that. But what are you showing them and telling that's going to make them like you a little bit, that's going to make them kind of understand you, maybe make them visualize you there on their campus and in their seats. So like the way these meetings often at most schools and all of the really elite schools is show of hands. I mean, honestly, they want unanimous. The admissions officer is pitching you. And what I noticed 2 years ago, and I reconfirmed this year, is that I can tell when an admissions officer really likes a student. Whenever they got into the essay, because they'll pick it up and they're like flipping through, and they'll either be like, oh, yeah, Rihanna, right? Like, yeah, okay, yeah, y'all find her. I'm going to show you this. Like, yeah, she's got great grades. She's got, she was a drum major. That's awesome. But in her essay, she told me this. And check out what she's saying here. Or look what I noticed about her here. And then you can tell maybe a student didn't make quite the impression on them, and they're like, Nick Smith. Yeah, hang on. Flipping through. And I realized that I can tell at that point with pretty good accuracy how the rest of the room is going to respond.
That's probably the most important thing I'll say today. I could tell just by the way the admissions officer introduced the student whether or not they were going to get in the "we really want this student" pile, or if they were about to get a rejection letter.
It was wild, but it's that social contagion of emotion. If your best friend comes up to you and is like, "Oh, you've got to read this book. I've finished it. I was up all night last night." Okay, maybe even if you're not a big reader, you might pick it up and see what the big deal is. But then if your 500-year-old librarian at school is like, "You must read this great book because it's going to fix your brain," or whatever, you might be like, "Okay, I'll get to that like in grad school." Like maybe someday. I've got stuff to do tonight. And what this is taught me was like, okay, I was right, even though I didn't realize quite why I was right, how big it went, I guess. This, you got to kind of make them like you. Because I wasn't thinking about everyone else in the room and how they're presenting you is going to affect everyone else's opinions who hasn't spent a lot of time looking your application over. They're just now looking at it for the first time. What else do they have to go on?
What realizing this also did was clarify why it was so important to show
Them as much about you, really, that we can. If they know you like music, they know you're a drum major, but they don't know you're also teaching
Redacted.
how to do this and why that's meaningful to you while this other thing is going on. Like,
because
they may not care so much about music. It may not compel someone or hook any one person in particular. But whenever we're using this thing to show these other bits of you, you've got a greater chance of capturing their attention. Because if you're like, "Oh, and I also teach puppies, how to do that," then they're like, "Oh, I love puppies." And so that's what I see when they're pointing out, "Oh, you've got to see what I learned about this student." Maybe it just shows that you're a nice person because you like puppies, which is good. But it's also a chance to capture someone who loves puppies. Does that make sense?
Redacted.
I generally start with the Common App statement because everyone's going to read it. So no matter who I'm working with, we always start with the Common App brainstorming session. And that's 2 hour session. We go through every single one of those questions. Okay. This year it'll be those first 6. And we start out, I just ask you, what does this bring up for you? What do you think? What's the first thing that pops in your head whenever I say this? We start there. I'm taking notes. I'm trying to get it in your voice as much as possible. And I'm pointing things out that you may not have noticed. I'm helping you find the connections between this thing you told me up here about your background and then this story you're telling me down in number 4 when you're talking about um, gratitude you have for your friends, or number 5 when you're telling me about this other thing that you really learned, that you have in your life. And I'm helping you make those connections between things, and I'm pushing for deeper reflection in the things that we kind of automatically skip over sometimes. There are 2 big reasons I see students skipping over things that I'm like, that's really big. Hang on, let's back up and check that out. Sometimes it's a vulnerable spot and our ego is like, yeah, we're just going to cushion that a little bit. And then there's the other piece that's you're just in your life right now. You're not 40 years old looking back at high school and thinking, what did I learn then that's made me who I am today? I doubt you've taken any classes in reflection, right? Maybe you haven't had any instruction in that. So I see my job as standing up here with, we'll say, wisdom of my age and experiences and watching where you're at in your little forest and pointing out, look, you just passed the river over here. You're thirsty. Let's like go there and see what happens. Or look at this connection. Look at this thing you didn't notice about, you know, why you were grateful to your mom about this thing. Look how that's connected to what you want to do when you grow up. And it's in those connections, in those intersections, where we find the unique details, okay, the things that make you you, because you only have the experiences available to you. And a lot of those are just high school experiences that everybody else is going to be writing about. But you're still a really unique person that I can just, just in the things you've already told me, I was noticing what I might assume about you from that. Not every kid comes in and mentions
Redacted.
in their introduction. So that automatically tells me a little bit of what's important to you because that's what you chose to tell me. That's what's at the front of your mind.
In part 2 of this conversation, the admissions coach talks more about strategizing, storytelling, and how admissions officers make their final cut. You can find part 2 at hippocampusacademy.us.